Well, Razorback fans, something we don't talk about enough in football is something that's really special, like special teams. But will they be special this year? Let's talk about it on today's Locked On Razorbacks podcast.
You are Locked On Razorbacks, your daily podcast on the Arkansas Razorbacks. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome into Locked On Razorbacks podcast. I am your host, John Nabors. I'm also the host of Inside Arkansas Live, which you can catch every weekday at noon on InsideArkansas.com. Today's episode is brought to you by FanDuel. Make every moment more as playoffs wind down. The sport stops sporting like we want them to, but this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost or a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone every day, all summer long. Visit FanDuel.com to get started. Hope everybody is having and did have a wonderful weekend. As we know, a lot of things to talk about, especially with fall camp being underway. And we'll have some recaps and some discussions and whatnot about what goes down at fall camp, which I'm always wondering, like, what actually happens at fall camp? You know what I'm saying? Like, does anything of significance happen? Does anybody care? I don't know. But either way, there's a lot of things that are going on. And one of the things that I got to witness, and it was a press conference, if you would, was Scott Fountain, who is the special teams coordinator for Arkansas. He's been there since Sam Pittman, one of the few coaches that has been there the entire time of Sam Pittman. And he didn't really say anything significant, and neither did the players, which is not a bad thing. Like, I'm not trying to be insulting or anything like that, but it's just when they get up there, you're kind of like, okay, I mean, that's fine. Just don't make mistakes. But it is something that really changes the approach of how things are viewed in the landscape of special teams and just the game in general. Because special teams is almost like having, maybe in comparison, like a bad center. Like, the only time you really see it is when it's bad. You know what I'm saying? Like, a center who's snapping the ball, you don't ever think about the snap itself until it's bad. And it's the same thing with special teams. You don't really think about the punting unless it's bad, or the kickoff return unless it's bad. And so it kind of only gets that type of highlight. But let's think about it in a perspective of how different it can be by having actually really good, well-established, well-ran special teams. I know people are probably already turning off the podcast. Right, dude, are you seriously talking about special teams? And yes, I am. I am talking about special teams because I think it's just because of the Scott Fountain press conference and everything. I feel like it's relevant right now. But to me, when you look at Arkansas over the past 10, 15, 20 years, there's always been ups and downs. And there's been great offenses, great defenses, bad offenses, bad defenses, great players, not so great players. But special teams has been one of those things to where you remember when it was really good and was a true threat. And then you also remember times where it was not so much. Like, for instance, Connor Limpert. You all remember Connor Limpert? He was the kicker for Arkansas mainly during the Chad Morris era. Do you realize that he was, statistically speaking, one of the best kickers to ever come through Arkansas? You probably don't. Why? Because the team was so bad, and they went 2-10 in back-to-back years. The only redeeming quality was the kicker, but it didn't matter. So a lot of you don't even remember that fact. And I'm not saying you should, but it just goes into my whole point of you not caring about certain things, or whether it's good or bad. It just addresses it with the team itself. And you've seen that in many of examples. But it felt like, say, during the time of Brett Bielema, the kicker wasn't all that great. You know, like, you had Cole Hedlund, who struggled, who actually went on, I guess, was it North Texas he went to? And ended up being pretty good for them. It's amazing how that worked out. But you never really had great kickers under Bielema. I know Connor Limpert was there towards the end, but some struggles there. And I remember he didn't have a special teams coordinator and coach. Maybe that's what played a factor into it, whatever it is. But then you had some decent punters. You know, you had a Toby Baker, if you remember him. You remember Sam Irwin Hill, who was really good too. So you have all of these different elements to where it's all kind of variant as far as when it happened and when it didn't happen. But I always look back to the 2010, 2011 era of special teams as kind of the golden era of special teams for Razorback sports, or Razorback football in this particular case. Because not only did you have a guy named Joe Adams, who was really good at punt return, and also a guy named Dennis Johnson, who was really good at kick return, but then you had Zach Hawker, who was one of the best kickers, most established kickers Arkansas's had. And you also had Dylan Breeding, who you probably kind of remember him. It's not like he was an All-American or even All-SEC, but he was a solid punter. You know, he just didn't have those major mistakes. He just didn't have those major times where just like screw-ups or anything like that. He was just really consistent and really solid. And because of that fact, it really changed the game. It really changed a lot of games for Arkansas that year. I even like to compare it to, and maybe side it up with, I think it was John L. Smith, who was the coach, ironically enough, of special teams. He called it something to the extent of battles for large chunks of land is essentially what it is, which, you know, and a great point is that's what special teams is like you're going to win the battle. How much land are you going to give up and how much land are you going to go take? And it makes a difference. Like when you have somebody that's a threat in the kick return, I know kick return hasn't been as part of the game anymore, which is sad because of the rule changes and all that. But when you have somebody legitimately as a threat there, it changes the approach of now they got to think about when they're kicking off to somebody. Now they got to think about whether or not they're going to, you know, just try to kick it up high or do a squib kick or whatever. It changes their game. Same thing with punt. If you have a legitimate punt returner, if you had a Joe Adams, they're not going to try to punt it to you. They're going to sky it up in the air. They're going to try to kick it out of bounds, or maybe sometimes they'll even go for it because they feel like it's a better option than punting it to you and your guy. I mean, there's just a lot of things like that that could just play. And even a field goal kicker. We'll take the field goal kicker. You have a guy that's able to be pretty consistent if he hits it between 45 and 55 yards consistently. It changes how you approach your offense, where it's like, hey, if you're in a close game and you're about in that range, or maybe at the fringe of that range, maybe you're at the 50 yards away, suddenly you're a little bit more comfortable of saying, okay, well, how about this? We'll run the ball here instead, because even if we don't get it, we at least feel comfortable with our kicker. Or on the other side of it, if your kicker's bad, then suddenly you're like, okay, we're going to have to go for this. We're going to have to be a little bit more risky. We're going to have to try a little bit harder because we don't have much faith in our kicker to be able. Like, it just changes things. It changes your whole approach to your game plan, to the team you're going up against, to situational awareness of what the game is and of what time and everything. And that's why it's so important. And for this year for Arkansas, it's kind of weird, to be honest. It's kind of weird. Special teams is going to be weird because right now, you probably couldn't even name who the kicker and the punter is. And if you do, you're just really good and you're really following along. But you're not going to have Cam Little anymore. Cam Little was a really good kicker, left early to go to the NFL, got drafted. So wish him nothing but the best. He was a really good, solid kicker overall for Arkansas. But right now, it looks like it's going to be Matthew Shipley, which is the transfer from Hawaii. And also, can't forget Vito Calvaruso, which, yes, he left Arkansas to go to Wisconsin and then left Wisconsin to come back to Arkansas. And so those are kind of going to be the guys in the mix for that particular position. And then at the punting position, you have Devin Bale, who's a transfer from Northern Colorado. And then also listed on the roster as another punter is Sam Dubwig, who is a true freshman from Cabot High School. I have no idea who those guys are, right? Now, punt return itself is going to be Isaiah Satania. Like, he's going to be the punt returner because he's really good. And I'm not trying to compare him like Joe Adams, but he's one of those players that has that type of athleticism and ability to where if he gets it in the right, like if he has room to run, he can take it to the house. So you feel really good about that. And then kickoff, it's kind of going to be, whatever. Because again, the kickoff is not really a part of the game as much anymore because of the way they moved it up, the way you can just call a fair catch no matter what, you get it at the 25-yard line. So it's almost not as important, but there's going to be times, folks, like think about last year. Think about last year and the one possession games that you had. I'm not saying that not Cam Little lost these games. Like I'm not saying that, but if you look at the final scores, you lost to LSU and Alabama by a field goal. On the road, you lost those games by a field goal. You lost to Ole Miss on the road by a touchdown. You lost to BYU at home by a touchdown. I don't even want to mention the Mississippi State game. But my point is, you had, 5 one-possession games. 5 losses that were one-possession games. Now, you could look at a lot of different things in a game and say, well, if this didn't happen, if that didn't happen, then it would have been different. Of course you can. But you can also do the same when it comes to your kicking game. Like if you would have made a field goal here, or if you didn't go for it here because you would have made the field goal, that also changes these games. You're going to be in games this year, just like you were last year, where they're going to be really close, coming down to the wire, final play of the game. How confident are you going to be in your kicker? Like for right now, for instance, Matthew Shipley saying if he's the guy that's going to be kicking field goals. If Arkansas goes on the road to Oklahoma State in Stillwater, and Arkansas's down 30-28, and they're lining up for a 48-yard field goal for Matthew Shipley, where is your confidence level going to be? I can tell where mine's going to be. It's not very high, and it's nothing to do with Matthew Shipley, just because I haven't seen it yet. But when you have that threat, it makes a difference. And also, since Arkansas is going to be in these close games, you got to be able to count on, no matter if it's in the fourth quarter at the final buzzer or it's in midway through the second quarter, make your field goals. You got to have some consistency there. Because I'm telling you right now, if it happens to where against UAPB or even Oklahoma State, you're seeing struggles, because I've seen some struggles already. There was struggles in the spring game, struggles there. If those end up being problematic, like you're not going to be able to win those close games the way you should. You shouldn't have to rely on having your quarterback, having your offense try to score from so far out instead of being afraid to kick a 40-yard field goal. This is the SEC. You should have a kicker. Every program in the SEC should have a kicker that can kick a 40-yard field goal consistently. I'm not saying it's easy, but if you're going to play big boy football, you got to have big boy players, and that includes the kicking game as well. Enough about special teams, right? Don't have to worry about that anymore. But either way, we're still going to talk about the big recruiting weekend that the Razorbacks had, and it was a big recruiting weekend. So stay with us. We'll talk about that here in just a second on the Locked On Razorbacks podcast. All right, so moving on into something a lot more important that we all know about is eBay Motors, because they're one of the official sponsors here on the Locked On Razorbacks podcast. Passion, drive, and patience, the formula for winning championships, is also what keeps your ride or die alive. eBay Motors has everything you need to maintain your vehicle and level it up to peak performance. Superchargers, roof racks, exhaust kits, LED headlights, and so much more. Whether you're into speed, power, or style, eBay Motors has you covered. With over 122 million parts for your number one ride or die, you'll always find exactly what you're looking for. And with eBay Guaranteed Fit, your part is guaranteed to fit your ride every time or your money back. Because with eBay Motors, you're burning rubber, not cash. So with all the parts that you need and all the prices you want, it's easy to make your car the MVP and bring home those huge wins. So keep your ride or die alive at ebaymotors.com. Eligible items only. Exclusions apply. eBay Guaranteed Fit only available to U.S. customers. All right, so moving on into the next segment of the Locked On Razorbacks podcast. Again, a big recruiting weekend for Arkansas. They got quite a few commitments. Some of them for the 2025 class, but some of them for the 2026 class as well. Now, we'll move through a few of these, but the biggest one that I think Arkansas, I don't even think it is, but it's like for sure, it was been Colton Yarborough, who was an edge rusher out of Durant, Oklahoma. He committed to the Razorbacks' class of 2026. He's 6'5", 220 pounds, and he's a bona fide four-star player. It's not one of these things that, we're saying he's a four-star player because one recruiting outlet said he was, even though the other one says he's three-star. No, this guy's a legit four-star player. He chose Arkansas over Oklahoma State, Georgia, LSU, and Colorado. I don't care about any of the schools that are even listed. When I see a player that chooses Arkansas over Georgia and LSU, that's good enough for me. He's the number 147 prospect in the country, and he's the top prospect out of the state of Oklahoma. He also had offers to Miami, Oregon, Tennessee, USC, Kansas State, and others. So really big get for Arkansas. I know that's still a year away, actually 2 years away, technically, for when he would even make it on campus. And who even knows what the team's going to look like? Who knows what the coaching staff's going to look like? Who knows what any of this stuff's going to look like? But it's still a good get. It's still a good get for Arkansas. And you still see Deke Adams, who I continue to say that he is underrated as a recruiter and underrated as a coach. He's still getting after it, man. He's still getting after it. So big thing for Arkansas there and trying to build the lines as well. And then also as part of the 2026 class, they had the defensive back Adam Austin, who also committed to Arkansas. And this was on the same day, 30 minutes after the fact, according to 24/7 Sports. He committed to Arkansas, and he was part of the Hog Wild hangout, and he chose the Razorbacks over Missouri, Baylor, Oklahoma State, and Kansas State, while also having offers from Texas Tech, Washington State, Vanderbilt, UNLV, Houston, and Iowa State. He's 6'2", 212 pounds, and Marcus Woodson was the lead recruiter in this, which is another thing, too. Like, Marcus Woodson is a really good coach, and I think Arkansas fans need to really recognize that. And just, you can think about some of the good hires or not so good hires that Sam Pittman's had, which he has had some bad hires. Not 100%. There's no denying that fact. But to me, I think Marcus Woodson has been one of the best hires Sam Pittman's ever made since he's been at Arkansas, because you went from having the secondary for Arkansas being so bad, the worst pass defense in the country, not really even close, just 2 years ago. And what did he do? He hires Marcus Woodson. He comes in, keeps some of the same players, and immediately makes the secondary tremendously better. Now, they're not perfect by any stretch, but you also got to, if you want to take it one step further, he's the coach of the safeties. The safeties were the biggest problem for Arkansas back in 2022. Like, they just had no safety help whatsoever. I mean, the cornerbacks weren't great, but you still had like Dwight McLaughlin. You still had some guys, Quincy McAdoo, before he got hurt, was coming along, but it was the safeties that ended up being so problematic. And he changed that overnight to where the safeties are actually a strength of the Razorback football team. So just giving credit where credit is due. But yeah, continuing to recruit, continuing to get after it, continue to bring on some guys there in the 2026 class, which, again, you'll love to see that. And then Arkansas also got a JUCO defensive back as part for the 2025 class, Shannon Blair. And what's funny is he's actually out of East Mississippi Community College. He is the out of the Scuba from, of course, Last Chance U for those of you who watched it. So adding a little secondary help there too. Hey, listen, I think the JUCO players and the JUCO route is not the worst route to go. I think that it needs to give a lot more help there when it comes around. And also, a running back, Cameron Settles, officially committed to Arkansas for the 2025 class, 5'11", 195. He chose Arkansas over Missouri, Arkansas State, Yale, Memphis, and Tulsa. He's out of Parkview. So again, big weekend for the Razorbacks, and they're going to continue to try to make this all happen. But we got a little basketball news and some cool news coming up next here on the Locked On Razorbacks podcast, so stay with us. All right, before we get into the basketball side of things too, folks, we all know that we love sports. We love them so much, and we never want them to stop. But as the playoffs wind down and we get these fewer games and sports just aren't sportsing like we all want them to, FanDuel lets us all keep the sports going whenever we want, and all we have to do is open up the app and dream up any of the bets and time in your mood, and you got it. And this summer, FanDuel is hooking up all customers with a boost and a bonus daily. That's right. There's something for everyone, every day, all summer long. So head over to FanDuel.com and start making the most out of your summer. FanDuel, the official sports betting partner of Major League Baseball. Okay, so final segment here on the Locked On Razorbacks podcast. Folks, I wanted to bring up Cashmir Chavis committing to the Razorbacks and the basketball team. He's actually going to be a part of this. It's crazy. He's going to be a part of it this year. Like, he is a guy that was a highly regarded player coming out of this class. And it's kind of wild to think that, of all the great players that they added in, they still were not done yet. Cashmir Chavis is one of them. And he's a combo guard. He had, I think he was committed to Washington originally, but had offers to Arizona State, Fresno State, Georgia, number 6 player in the state of Minnesota, and just a nice little addition to the Razorback roster. So I don't know how much he'll play. I don't know what role he'll play in, but you got a guy that other schools wanted, and it can't hurt. Can't hurt to have. So that is awesome. But also, I wanted to use this time real quick to mention the fact that the Locked On Razorbacks podcast, we're actually going to be adding in an additional afternoon podcast each and every day, each and every afternoon. And I'm really excited about that because, Locked On has done so many great things. Locked On Razorbacks, we've blown it up, man. We've been awesome and grown into the number one Razorback podcast in the world. And I'm very proud of that. And it's also so cool to be able to grow it. And so each and every afternoon, you're going to hear 2 different editions of the Locked On Razorbacks podcast in variations. Like, for instance, this afternoon, you're going to hear the Locked On Razorbacks Pod at the Palace edition, where Curtis Wilkerson, good friend of mine and fellow coworker of Inside Arkansas, he's going to be joining me every day here on Locked On. We're going to talk basketball, strictly basketball. And that's going to be 3 days a week. And then Andrew Ellis is also going to be joining us here on the Locked On Podcast Network to have the bombastic edition of the podcast, which will be straight baseball driven, which will be awesome. So here in the mornings on my podcast, or on my morning podcast, we're going to be really football driven. That way, don't overlap and all that. So this was just kind of a lead into that. But I'm really excited about it. It's great to be able to have Curtis and Andrew be a part of Locked On. Really appreciate Locked On, helping this out and making this happen because, again, we want to continue to expand and continue to grow the Locked On brand and the Locked On Podcast Network. And with Locked On Razorbacks being one of the best college Locked On podcasts in the world, what better way to have than some of the most insightful and intelligent and well-respected people who cover the respective sports than Curtis Wilkerson and Andrew Ellis. So they're going to be joining me every day. So you're going to see in the afternoons another podcast pop up on your feed, also on the YouTube page, and that's going to be why. So really excited about it and can't wait to get it going. But appreciate each and every one of you listening in and watching in to the Locked On Razorbacks podcast. Be sure to like and subscribe to the podcast on iTunes or on Google Play. You can also get after me on Twitter at John Nabors Show for any questions, comments, concerns that you may have. Keep it going from there. Same podcast time, same podcast channel tomorrow afternoon. Have a great day, everybody. We'll see you then.